Hey guys! This is a new series in which you will see a person from our world getting reincarnated in the Marvel work with Superman powers. It's going to be very interesting when we see how a man becomes stronger than God in a world where gods and demons really exists. So without a delay, let's start the video. Chapter 1, Chapter 001 Transmigration. A heavy fog enveloped every corner of the city, and occasionally sharp warning from the air defense radar sirens struck the dark sky. In today's time, the Axis powers, headed by the Germans, fought inextricably with the Allied powers. Every day, a news story or news will pop up about the war casualties and the international situation. From Europe to Asia, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The flames of war were everywhere, and bullets were being fired at every second. No one knows what one will come first, hope to end this war or destruction of the whole world. In Luke's opinion, everything happening was just terrible. If only I had traveled to any other point of time in history. It would have been nice to enter the world a few decades from now. I would have gone to Hollywood, written a few scripts, made a few movies, and would have become the richest person in the world. Enjoying my life at its fullest. Located on the corner of the street was an empty tavern. Luke held his head in his hands, put his legs on the table, and sighed at his fate. Or, they could have just given me a normal world. The US economy after World War II was unprecedentedly prosperous. If I seized the opportunity, it wouldn't have been difficult to earn my first pot of gold. It's just. Why am I in the Marvel universe? Luke sighed and unfolded that day's newspaper. The most striking headline was the meeting between President Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin in Tehran. The Allies wanted to open a second battlefield in Europe to defeat the Germans as soon as possible. It's just that what attracted his attention was not the direction of the World War, but the lace scandal in the corner of the page. Howard Stark and Hollywood's goddess of love Rita Hayworth were photographed by reporters entering and exiting the Waldorf Astoria hotel together. There was also an obvious black and white photo below this headline. Stark Industries. 20-year-old, Luke now had a wry smile on his face. Perhaps in the eyes of others, Howard Stark was just a smart arms tycoon sitting on wealth. But for Luke, the other party had another critical identity. He was the father of the future Iron Man, Tony Stark. The existence of Howard Stark allowed Luke to confirm that he really did transmigrate in the Marvel universe. And now, he was standing at the beginning of everything. The beginning of the timeline before all significant events were about to unfold. This was both good news and bad news for him. The good news was that Luke wouldn't have to see Thanos, the chief of the universe family planning department, snap his finger because Luke will be 100 years old by that time and may not even be alive on that fateful day. The bad news was that he wouldn't get the chance to meet Chief Coulson or go to Queens and find Spider-Man. Let alone the Avengers, he didn't even know where Nick Fury will be in the coming years. Luke never expected that he would start from the United States in the context of World War II. And somehow became a naive guy on the streets of Brooklyn. It's a headache to think about it. Luke covered his face with the newspaper, feeling depressed over his condition. He had traveled into this world for almost 5 or 6 years and had already accepted the new identity of Luke Cavill. He came to know that his family were Irish immigrants, however, his father died in gang fights, and his mother died of tuberculosis. The only good thing that came out of this was that there was no little sister to take care of. That would have been a headache. Luke's only relative was the uncle who used to paint the house for people when he was young. Paint the house. This is a black word. Luke's uncle is not a craftsman who painted the house walls. This sentence he used was referring to murder. Because it's hard not to splash blood on the wall when dealing with certain troubles, gangsters were used to using the term cleaning the house after doing the dirty work. Luke's uncle was such a man who did dirty work for the gang when he was young. He used to be an army veteran, and later to support his family, he began to clean up houses for the gang. Because of his decisiveness and clean hands, he had never left any clues and was always appreciated by the senior gangsters. In the years since his parents passed away, Luke also relied on his uncle's assistance to avoid starving to death. The plot armor that I haven't received for so long. Luke felt even more concerned when he thought of the cheats that every transmigrator must have. First of all, the reason why he could cross over. It was because of a very nonsense reason. It was due to a game, Golden Kryptonite. That's right, at that time, Luke was addicted to fighting games that had superheroes as the central character. Moreover, Golden Kryptonite was very addictive, trying to use a rude and straightforward way to change the main character's fate. One afternoon, he couldn't hold back for a while and ended up purchasing the luxurious gift pack in the game, which contained an SSS-level card, the Superman, and multiple selection templates of Kryptonite. It can be said that if we take contents of the gift pack in the picture, it was extremely cost-effective. As soon as he received the gift package, Luke opened it to check its contents. However, the next time he opened his eyes, he was in the Marvel Universe. Chapter 2, Chapter 002 Bucky Barnes. When he transmigrated, there was a screen projected in front of his eyes. Maybe due to the bad signal or good luck, that expensive gift item had also come with him. It took 5 to 6 years for it to connect and load the progress. 99%. Luke glanced at the progress bar in the consciousness space. An expression of expectation appeared on his face. Over the years, he insisted on doing 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and actively running in the sun every day, just to wait for the moment when the luxurious gift package will open. Unfortunately, he didn't know if it was too far away from his Earth. Or was it a bad signal? Or there were other reasons. The progress bar had always been stuck at 99% as if that was the final destination, and it didn't wish to take any step further. This gave Luke a headache. Do I have to collect infinity stones to load this thing? That's cheating. Luke curled his lips in frustration. If he could get superhuman powers, then he will be able to survive longer in this dangerous world. By that time, his life may be better than his time on the real Earth. I want my cheat. Just as Luke whined inwardly, the door of the bar was pushed open. Ding dong. The crisp bell at the door sounded. Luke. I have been looking for you for a long time. The young man wearing the brown uniform of an army soldier and holding a newspaper in his hand said, I went to your house and found that you weren't there, so I ran to old Joseph's bar. I knew you were here. The handsome, high-spirited young man took out a chair and sat on the opposite side of Luke. I'm helping old Joseph look at the store. He is sick. Luke, still with the newspaper on his face, asked unenthusiastically, Bucky, did you succeed? The young man sitting across from him is the future Winter Soldier, a good friend of Captain America, James Barnes. Bucky was his nickname, and it can also be regarded as a kind of affectionate name, which was only used by his close friends. Of course. The 107th Infantry Regiment. You should call me Sergeant James Barnes from now on. I will set sail for England tomorrow morning. Bucky lifted his chest and raised his head with a proud look on his face. It was World War II, and Uncle Sam's recruitment posters were all over the States. The passionate propaganda and pervasive TV speeches inspired a large number of young people's patriotism. They couldn't wait to go to the battlefield and win the Medal of Honor. "It's a pity that I can't be with you." Luke pretended to be disappointed. He didn't actually plan to join the army. Bucky patted his friend on the shoulder in a reassuring manner and said, "Someone has to stay to take care of Steve. That guy always likes to fight for justice, it's really annoying sometimes." He and Luke had discussed secretly, hoping that someone could stay here. It's a pity that Luke lost in that wine fight to decide who could join the army. Well, he did lose on purpose. It's not bad to think about it. All the men in New York would have gone to the army. There are about 3.5 million women left in this city. Maybe I can have a chance to soothe some of them, their fragile and beautiful hearts." Luke joked. He and Bucky had known each other years ago. The other party and Steve Rogers are both original friends. Bucky sighed. "Steve doesn't think so, he has a dead brain." He frowned when he thought of the little man who also wanted to rush to the battlefield like himself. However, he was just not at the right standards to become a soldier. "When shall we go to Steve? He must be in that cinema again." Shaking off the sadness in his head, Bucky took out a few tickets from his pocket and said enthusiastically, "I will go to Stark Industries World Expo tonight. I have a date with some pretty girls." Chapter 3, Chapter 003 The Three Friends. When Luke and Bucky walked towards the cinema on the opposite side of the street, Steve Rogers, the future Captain America, was being beaten in a back alley. Bang. A punch hit Steve in the stomach, convulsing his face in pain. Unable to maintain his balance, Rogers was knocked to the ground. His thin body gave no defense against the street gangster. The street gangsters caused a lot of trouble and harassed everyone. However, none of the bystanders dared to stand up against these people in fear of getting into unnecessary trouble. Only a fool like Steve will risk being severely beaten and jump out to stop these gangsters from causing trouble. After getting punched, Steve, who had now fallen in a corner, picked up the lid of the trash can next to him in a hurry and used it as a shield to block the next punch. In his eyes, there was not even the slightest tinge of fear, but there was a look of resolution as he stood up. Like a brave soldier. However, it's a pity that his courage couldn't cover the massive gap in size and strength. The gangster waved his fist and knocked Rogers back on the ground again. But it didn't take long for the little man to struggle and stand up as if he wasn't feeling any pain. As he took up the posture of a boxer, he gasped, "I can do this all day." His punches were slow, and his strength was not enough, so he was quickly blocked by the gangster. "Looks like you haven't learned your lesson." The gangster sneered and clenching his fists, he targeted Rogers' nose this time. "I am going to teach you not to be so nosy." However, bang. A strong force came from behind. The gangster let out a scream as he lost his balance and staggered towards the wall. "Who the fuck are you? Don't you fucking dare touch my friend here." A cold voice rang from behind. The gangster turned his head quickly and found two young men. One was wearing a nicely ironed brown military uniform, while the other had a leather jacket. The latter is staring at him with sharp eyes. "Luke. This kid was being nosy. I didn't know he was your friend." Bang. Without saying a word, Luke stepped forward and punched the gangster's nose. The guy leaned to the side and fell heavily on the hard road. Blood began to flow out from his nose, unceasingly. However, Luke didn't stop there. He lifted his legs, stepping on the gangster's face with his dark black boots, almost crushing his teeth. Ah! Luke! The mud and dirt on the shoes poured into the gangster's mouth. With the blood spilling from the nose, it gave out a strange smell. After a while, Luke let go of him and said coldly, "Get out of here. Next time I see you bullying my friend, I might come over to paint the house." The gangster, with blood all over his face, ran out of the alley in embarrassment, without even uttering a single word. He was afraid of Luke because of Luke's uncle. Moreover, Luke worked with the Irish gang, so he couldn't afford to offend Luke. "That's why I have asked Luke to stay in Brooklyn to take care of you." Bucky, in his military uniform, stretched out his hand to lift Rogers. With a helpless expression on his face, he continued, "Sometimes, I think you just like to get beaten up, otherwise why do you always like to provoke these assholes that you can't beat?" Rogers patted the dust on his clothes and took a breath from his inhaler to calm himself down. The pain on his face was finally transmitted back to the brain, and now he felt a burning sensation. Earlier, he relied on the adrenaline rush of his courage, and didn't feel the physical pain. Now, Rogers felt like he needed to go and find a doctor as soon as possible. "You went to the conscription station again?" Just then, Luke picked up the enlistment form on the ground, which had Steve Rogers' identity information written on it. "It's illegal to fake a draft form, Steve." Luke rubbed his palms. Fortunately, he had been exercising all year round and was quite physically strong, so it was no big deal for him to beat up a street gangster. He, Rogers, and Bucky grew up in Brooklyn. But compared to him, the two of them had much similar experience as kids. Firstly, both of their parents died in the war. Steve's father, Joseph Rogers, served in the 107th Infantry Division and was killed by a German grenade in an ambush. His mother was a nurse in the tuberculosis ward. Unfortunately, she was also infected and could not survive. As for Bucky's background experience, it was also similar. His father also served in the 107th Infantry Division but died in an accident in a military exercise and was raised by his mother. Therefore, both of the kids, who have known each other since childhood, became inseparable brothers. "I just want to do something." Rogers lowered his head slightly, feeling depressed as he coughed up blood due to the punch earlier. Chapter 4, Chapter 004. Some want peace, while others want fortune. Steve was not only thin and weak but also had mild asthma. Then there were his occasional chest and body pains. With such a physique, sending him to the war was no different than killing him. Therefore, every time Rogers went to the recruitment station, he would be rejected. Rogers looked up at his friend and hesitantly said, "You didn't need to be so angry, Luke." Luke frowned slightly, then giving a friendly smile, he said, "I have to do that. Everyone will begin to push you around. This is Brooklyn, after all." Luke is right. If it weren't for his uncle and his own good connections in the Irish gang, we don't know how much trouble we would have faced every day. Bucky nodded in agreement. The punks always bullied him and Rogers in the past. This went on for days, being blocked in a corner and non-stop fighting on the streets. Until one day, they met Luke and soon became good friends. Keeping each other's backs, their friendship grew deeper. And in Bucky's eyes, Luke was very quick-witted. He came up with an idea to make money, taking advantage of the strict discipline of military bases and the fact that soldiers weren't allowed to go out of the base. These three then sneaked into the barracks to sell small things like alcohol and tobacco. Because their parents were old comrades, many people turned a blind eye to their sneaky actions and chose to leave them be. They made quite a significant amount of money by relying on this business. Later, this attracted the attention of the bootlegging gangs in Brooklyn. Editor note: bootleggers mostly include smugglers. Due to this, Luke had to make good relationships with the Irish gangs and even took the initiative to part away with a big chunk of his sneaky business to escape from the trouble caused by the bootleggers. As they talked about how Luke lost his fight earlier with Bucky, he joked, "That's good, you stay here and continue running this business. When I come back, maybe both of you will already be rich. Just like Howard Stark." No one knows how long the war will last. For civilians, they hoped that the guns would stop firing as soon as possible and life would return to normal. But for others, this was an excellent opportunity to make a fortune. Industrialists will never let go of any opportunity to accumulate wealth. Many people knew that before the United States participated in this world war, it sold a large number of weapons and equipment to the Axis and Allies at the same time, thereby making a fortune. Among them was Stark Industries, which had gained a lot of fame and money in recent years. It continues its rapid growth, jumping up and standing side by side with those old military-industrial groups, mainly because Howard Stark seized the opportunity. He used his own witty mind and was also the central figure in many new inventions, which was appreciated a lot by the Ministry of National Defense. Then he used the colossal wealth to make connections with the upper class, thus laying a broad and sound foundation for the future. In just a few decades, he had become a huge military tycoon. Apart from the rapidly growing Stark Industries, oil companies also seized this opportunity. They broke through the British blockade through neutral countries like Switzerland and shipped barrels of oil to Germany, and made huge profits from this deal. As a multinational corporation and industrial giant, Ford was even more exaggerated. He even helped the Germans produce trucks and made some hidden political investments. Therefore, Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Company, was awarded the Grand Cross, the highest medal awarded to foreigners by the Germans. Anyone can see from this that the industrialists were not taking sides in this war. They only had one purpose, and that was to make more money. Even now that the United States had entered the war and joined the Allied powers, with the political scene getting more and more serious, it still didn't stop people from going after wealth. Howard Stark. I don't have that kind of mind. Luke smiled slightly, and he turned his head and said to Rogers, "Steve, if you really want to join the army, there are many other drafting stations. I can accompany you to some, let's try our luck there." "Really?" There was a surprised smile on Rogers's face. Bucky had always opposed him from joining the army, and there have been several arguments between the two. However, Luke rarely expressed his stance, but today he suddenly agreed to accompany him to the drafting stations. This made Rogers very happy. Standing next to them, Bucky was about to say something, but when he saw Luke throw a look that said, "I know what I am doing," he chose to remain silent. He knew that Luke, a friend who was the quietest among their group of three, would never do anything without reason. "All right then, tonight is my last night in New York. Are you guys planning to waste time in this alley?" Bucky changed the topic. He was going to be on the battlefield tomorrow, rushing to a foreign country. However, tonight, he would enjoy his time with hot ladies and get drunk with his best friends. Chapter 5, Chapter 005 Stark Industries World Expo. By the time Luke and Bucky came out of Roger's house, it was already dusk with the sun setting on the horizon. The afterglow of the setting sun illuminated New York, coating the surrounding skyscrapers with a layer of golden glow. In the future, you may have to look after yourself. Luke and I can't always be there every time." Bucky patted Roger's shoulders, while the little man felt awkward and remained silent. The scars on his face were not severe, and after some cleaning, only faint bruises remained. The three of them put on some good clothes and headed to the Stark Industries World Expo. On the way, Rogers frowned while saying, "I also want to join the 107th Infantry Division like you. You know, my father was also once part of it." He was still unwilling to stay behind. Due to the war propaganda, many youngsters were eager to join the army at this time. They wanted to step onto the battlefield and win some honor medals. Rogers and Bucky are among them. Compared to Bucky, who had more than average physique, Rogers is thin, weighed less than 100 pounds, and had a mild asthma case. So even if he were allowed to join the army, he would have to run for several kilometers, ending up exhausted and panting for breath. This can even lead to death due to his weak body. His physique prevented him from joining the army even if Rogers changed his address and falsified his identity every time he went to the conscription station to look for chances to join the military. His medical evaluation always turned out to be 4F, the worst score. Editor note, check paragraph comment here. Luke, who was walking behind, with his hands in his pockets, smiled as he said, "There will always be more opportunities." He was thinking about whether to find a way to get the super soldier serum or not. His regular workout and exercise over the years had promoted the progress bar to 99% and was only one step away from being unlocked. Intuition told Luke that he needed a solid external boost to get the progress bar to 100%. At present, the easiest and most likely to work thing for him was the super soldier serum. As a transmigrator who roughly understood the direction of the plot, Luke knew that tonight was going to be a turning point in the life of Steve Rogers. This little man was going to encounter Dr. Abraham Erskine, a German scientist who had sought refuge in the Allies and was the super soldier serum's inventor. He was moved by Steve Rogers' heartfelt words and strong will and gave him the opportunity to join the army. Later at the military base, Rogers was selected to be the receiver of the super soldier serum. Should I take it or not? Luke, who was walking behind, was still undecided about this. If he could grow stronger silently, he would not have such thoughts, and in no way was he going to join the army. After all, the battlefield was full of bullets and constant danger. Even Captain America and the Winter Soldier were not entirely safe. However, the delay in receiving his plot armor gave Luke a headache. There was really no other option, he had to take this gamble. As Luke was distracted, he unknowingly followed Rogers and Bucky to the bar on the corner. Many people were present at the bar, ordering beers and snacks, chatting non-stop, waiting for the start of the World Expo by the Stark Industries. Rogers still looked a little sullen and hadn't yet dispelled the idea of joining the army. Bucky didn't notice it. He was already enthusiastic about defeating the Germans and bringing victory for the Allies. "Let's go. I know some hot chicks." After looking at the time, Bucky and Rogers left the bar. The streets outside were pitch black, and only the World Expo venue was brightly lit, giving it a great look. At this time, World War II was in full swing. Like European countries, the United States was also on the cusp. To save energy, the military had implemented intense electricity control policies. Like neon lights and colorful billboards, they were restricted at night. Every night, the city will occasionally cut off electricity to prioritize and ensure the power supply to the military bases and government agencies. Even New York is no exception. However, Tonight, because of the Stark Industries World Expo, the military significantly relaxed the restrictions. Otherwise, New Yorkers wouldn't see such a brightly lit scene. It's quite lively. Bucky smiled as they entered the venue. Chapter 6, Chapter 006, The Inheritance of the Starks. T/N, you guys are amazing. Here's your extra chapters. Inside the World Expo of tomorrow's venue, the event was indeed quite lively. The crowd was chattering aloud, and the lights were gorgeous. Everywhere, one can see young men and women hugging and enjoying the mood. Luke and his two pals stood close to a vast metal globe, silently eating the snacks they bought from the bar earlier while waiting for the girls. Soon, 3 young and lively girls waved their hands and called them over. They wore brightly colored cotton dresses and flat heels, looking enthusiastic and reserved at the same time. Bucky beckoned and pointed at Luke and Rogers behind him while saying, "Girls, they are my friends." The girls, ignoring the small thin figure in between, looked over or Luke, one by one. Currently, Steve Rogers was not yet the Captain America with a huge build and strengthened muscles, and there was no so-called American ass. Naturally, he couldn't attract these young girls. However, Luke, on the other hand, looked pretty good. The neat short black hair and the slightly stern young face could make any girl feel interested in him. "Don't be stubborn, Rogers. You gotta have some fun," Bucky said as he put his hands over the thin man's shoulders. While Luke, who was now walking in the front, was surrounded by the young girls, listening to them chattering about boring stuff. They soon crossed the area with the metal globes. Passing through some small exhibition halls, they entered the core area. "Welcome to the Modern Marvels Pavilion." The narrator's voice paused slightly, and then with increased depth in his tone, he continued, "The world of the future. A greater world. A better world. Everything starts with Stark Industries." The people coming and going clapped and shouted in admiration, with a novel look in their eyes. The steel dummy in the glass showcase, the airplane model that was hanging from the ceiling, and the glass curtain wall showing Howard Stark's inventions. These were undoubtedly quite advanced and emerging products that the public found very attractive. However, Luke didn't feel much enthusiastic about these. He was from the 21st century and had already binge-watched enough sci-fi movies to get excited from this expo's exhibitions. The gadgets placed as showcases could hardly arouse his interest. However, the girls, who held his arms left and right, were so surprised as if they had found a whole new world. It gave Luke a headache. Sometimes, he wanted to be like Rogers, strolling behind with a cup of popcorn, enjoying the moment in peace. As if sensing Luke's mood, Rogers, who was standing behind them, picked up a few popcorns and threw them into his mouth with a smirk on his face. However, Luke was relieved soon. The 2 girls around him suddenly screamed like fans and rushed to the base of the main exhibition area stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Howard Stark," the host on the stage announced as the curtains opened. Several beautiful women in tight waistcoats and black tuxedos did an excellent performance in front of a red car. Then, Howard Stark, with a mustache, walked onto the stage. There was a burst of violent applause from the audience. Howard Stark, the man of the era. A young genius with a clever mind. However, the love scandals of this genius never seemed to stop. Howard, who walked out from behind the scenes, did not greet the audience but deeply kissed a beautiful girl on stage, with a confident and charming smile on his face. This guy really is the father of Iron Man, can't deny that. Standing in the audience, Luke felt quite impressed. Thinking about Iron Man, who once had a fantastic feat of sleeping with every cover girl of the Playboy magazine throughout a year, made him feel that being flirty and having lots of affairs was the true inheritance of the Stark family. Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you, in just a few short years, your automobile won't even have to touch the ground at all? He moved the microphone, took out a handkerchief, and wiped his lips while the audience, with audible gasps, digested what he had said. He seemed to enjoy the gazes of the audience while talking about his company's innovative technology. He then beckoned the pretty girls to take off the wheels of the red car. Standing on the stage, Howard Stark was not like a scientist, but he was more of a magician who was also well versed in acting skills. He knew how to grab the audience's attention. With Stark gravitic reversion technology, you will be able to do just that. Howard smiled and turned on the power by moving the lever on the podium. The car, whose wheels had been removed, slowly began to float in the air. This magical scene made the audience hold their breath. Chapter 7, Chapter 007. Dr. Abraham Erskine, the creator of the Super Soldier Serum. The corner of Luke's lips twitched when he heard Howard Stark talking about how he was about to change the future. Luke had no interest in all this nonsense. Although the man in front of him can be regarded as one of the smartest people alive in the world, he sometimes acted a bit immaturely, similar to his son, Tony Stark. Both of them had a common characteristic, or a characteristic that was in their genes. They were not easy to deal with. Perhaps this can be called a common problem among geniuses. While everyone was focused on Howard Stark, Luke sneaked out of the crowd to get rid of the starstruck girls. Just as he turned his head, he saw Roger's thin back. He passed through the crowd and walked to the conscription station not far away. Luke took a deep breath standing at the main entrance. He knew that this was going to be the beginning of Captain America. Putting his hands in his pocket, he thought about what he should do next. Although it can be said that up until now, everything was going as per the plot. But who knows when his cheat will arrive? While thinking about what to do, Luke saw the figure of an old man. He had gray hair, was a little bald, and glasses on the bridge of his nose. Abraham Erskine. Luke recognized him within an instant. Abraham Erskine, the developer of the Super Soldier Serum, and the German scientist whose prototype serum turned the Hydra leader into Red Skull, was now walking slowly into the conscription station. Luke, who was about to enter the conscription station, suddenly turned serious. Home. Someone's following him. He saw that behind Abraham Erskine, a few men in black suits, wearing round hats, were closely following him. There were visible bulges around their waists. Their expression was nervous as they looked around. They didn't look like ordinary tourists, and the bulges on their waist gave Luke a bad feeling. Suddenly a thought flashed through Luke's mind: Hydra. As the creator of the Super Soldier Serum, Dr. Erskine was a thorn in the eyes of Hydra. The Red Skull would do anything possible to get rid of this variable. Once the Allies get the chance to mass-produce the Super Soldier Serum and create a large number of super soldiers, there won't be any suspense regarding the result of the war. With such thoughts flashing through his mind, Luke walked into the conscription station. Steve. Bucky finally came back to his senses after Howard Stark's sensational performance and turned to look at his friend, only to find that he had long since disappeared. Luke. He turned to the other side, but he didn't expect to not see Luke either. What's the matter? Where did both of them go? Bucky was about to go out, however, he was dragged back to the exhibition by the girls. The war is not for you. In the conscription station, Rogers was rejected again. The officer who recruited soldiers into the army saw his thin body and gave his judgment without even thinking anything. He didn't even read the application form. Although Rogers argued, his words were ignored. No matter what he said, the officer just shook his head in denial. In his opinion, sending this thin little man to war was no different from killing him. In the end, the officer got impatient. You can still serve the country without joining the army. We are in urgent need of factory workers. You can go to the factory to help in making weapons for the front line, or you can find another job. He pushed back Roger's application form, with an indifferent expression on his face. You will be a burden to others in the war. Instead of this, it is better to stay back in the country. Listen, kid. Don't risk your life like this. Not everyone has a chance to stay back home. The officer didn't get why this little guy wanted to join the army. Wouldn't it be best to stay in America? Let alone the horrors of war, his life will be safest here. No matter how precious the Medal of Honor is, can it be more important than one's life? Who doesn't know that the Allied and the Axis powers are fighting non-stop? Every day both sides were losing thousands of men. God knows how many corpses were left to rot in the trenches, with no way of even giving them an honorary burial. Sir, I want to fight for the country. And I won't be any burden to anyone. The draft officer avoided Roger's firm eyes and just shook his head in denial. Even he needs to follow some rules. He can't just recruit an unqualified soldier. Their argument soon attracted the attention of Abraham Erskine. He looked at Rogers, who was depressed, and he seemed to think of something. It's going exactly like the plot. Luke watched quietly from a corner with a small smile over his lips. But he suddenly retracted his smile when he noticed the men in black suits who were following behind Abraham Erskine came closer. With cold eyes and murderous intent, they slowly moved their right hand toward the bulge of their waist. Just then, one of the men tucked his coat and pulled out a hidden pistol. Aiming at Dr. Abraham Erskine, he pulled the trigger in the next second. Bang, Chapter 8, Chapter 008 Saving Dr. Erskine. Bang, As soon as the gun was fired, the crowd at the conscription station immediately fell into chaos. With panic-stricken screams, they started to run in all directions, trying not to get hit by any bullets. Those recruits who had yet to be enlisted suddenly ran away like ants, with no clue what's happening whatsoever. They had never been to a battlefield, nor had they received any formal training, so have no idea what to do. The security guard at the gate fell on the ground as blood gurgled out of the bullet hole in the white hat on his head. Keep quiet. Luke, who was hiding at the side, pulled the fallen Dr. Erskine up from the ground and ran towards the hallway. Bullets kept on raining from behind, hitting walls and creating debris and dust throughout the hall. Luke looked out for Rogers and found him hiding behind a table with his hands covering his head. He held Dr. Erskine and ran towards Rogers. Suddenly Luke couldn't help but come up with a strange thought: if the future Captain America dies, in which direction will the future lead to? Will there be a new hero? Or will the Germans win and the Red Skull conquers the world? Bang, 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 The gunshot interrupted Luke's thoughts. He looked at the nervous Dr. Erskine, and whispered, "You stay here. Don't go anywhere." In the hallway, the sound of approaching footsteps could be heard. Under the table, Luke slowly emerged. He took out the Colt M1911 from his waist, took a deep breath, and rushed out towards the hallway. 5 minutes earlier. Outside the conscription station. You lost Dr. Erskine. German spies are most likely hiding in the city, trying to capture and kill Dr. Erskine. Don't you understand how important he is? Start searching for him. A female officer was reprimanding the security guards with an ice-cold expression. The security guards in plain clothes nodded repeatedly, trying to suppress the dismissive look in their eyes. This is a tempestuous era and the status of women had not been taken seriously. Most people still held the idea that women should stay at home as wives and do housework. There was no need to go outside. Even if the stern and cold female officer in front of them was their superior, the respect in their eyes of security guards was merely perfunctory. We were separated from him. There were too many people at the expo gate. Who knows where the old German man went? One of the security guards defended themselves. He is called Dr. Abraham Erskine. The female officer corrected. This cannot change the fact that he and Hitler are from the same country. Another security guard retorted with a sneering expression. Due to the deliberate propaganda by the government, the public had a deep hatred for the Germans. Even if Abraham Erskine was now with the Allied powers, the prejudices against him just couldn't be stopped. Asterisk bang, asterisk. Just then they heard a clear gunshot from the nearby conscription station. A suppressed scream from pain could be faintly heard as soon as the gunshot was fired. And soon people rushed out of the building. Her expression turned pale, giving the security guards a cold look. She quickly moved towards the noise. Asterisk asterisk 3 minutes later. Asterisk asterisk. The female officer rushed to the conscription station followed by a team of fully equipped soldiers. They found several cold corpses on the ground and the pungent smell of blood everywhere in the hall. Doctor. The female officer finally had a sigh of relief when she saw Dr. Erskine safe and sound. He was now in the highest level protection list of the military and was also a major concern for the Germans. Everyone now understood the value of the super soldier serum created by Dr. Abraham Erskine. It could end this war. The delicate balance between both sides would change and then it would turn into a one-sided massacre. In the end, the whole future can be influenced. These people should be spies they sent. Dr. Erskine, who had now recovered from the panic, said calmly, "It seems that Schmidt really doesn't want me to live anymore." The female officer nodded her head in agreement. Then, she swept her eyes at the two young men next to Dr. Erskine. There was clear alertness in her glance. "Fortunately this guy saved me." Then turning towards one of the men beside him, he said, "By the way, I don't know your name yet." He saw Luke alone get rid of the 3 spies who came here to assassinate him, and though he was one of the security guards sent by the government to protect him. But judging from the alert eyes of the female officer, this man was not from the government. "My name is Luke. Luke Cavill." Chapter 9, Chapter 009 Meeting Peggy Carter. Luke put away the gun with a smile while introducing himself. He didn't expect to meet Dr. Abraham Erskine and Peggy Carter in this way. "That's right. The female officer standing in front of him will be one of the founders of the SHIELD. Right now, she should be an agent for the Office of Strategic Services, responsible for protecting Abraham Erskine and participating in the Super Soldier Project. You killed these spies," Peggy Carter said as she looked at the corpses. "You got some good skills." As she scrutinized the bodies of the spies, she found that all 3 were killed by a single shot. There were no extra traces of being hit. All the bullets had struck the vital parts, killing them instantly. Judging from the wounds alone, she deduced that Luke must have some good marksmanship. Moreover, there was no panic or any other intense emotion in his eyes, even after killing 3 people. No matter how one looked at it, it wasn't a work of a beginner. Such an amazing performance was the very reason for Peggy to be suspicious. How was it possible for ordinary youngsters from Brooklyn to take out German spies so casually? If this was true, then the Allies would have captured Berlin long ago and put an end to this war. Well, I learned some self-defense skills. Luke casually answered. He did learn fighting and shooting from his Uncle Frank long ago. The latter even thought about training Luke to be a gangster. Irish gangs were rising rapidly, but they just lacked some good guys who could handle the killings. Unfortunately, Luke had no interest to follow that path. Although he worked hard to learn fighting and shooting, and even insisted on exercising, it was only to increase his means of self-protection. He was not a dumb guy who had dreams of becoming a gangster godfather. "Doctor, it's not safe here. Let's leave first." The female officer retracted her gaze from Luke and looked at Dr. Erskine, whispered softly, "We will investigate all for this afterwards." "Okay." Dr. Erskine nodded, then as he looked Luke and said, "I will keep your name in my mind, Luke." Dr. Erskine was here because he was invited by Howard Stark to the World Expo of tomorrow. However, after meeting him, Dr. Erskine felt that the young and promising Mr. Stark was more like a businessman. The enthusiasm for climbing toward the peak of science was far less than his interest in amassing wealth and chasing women. Therefore, in the end, the two of them only exchanged a few words, and then they didn't talk much about other important topics. "Is he your friend?" Before leaving, Erskine looked at Steve Rogers on the side. For some reason, he was very interested in this small, thin man. Perhaps it was the conversation between the other party and the conscription station officer that brought back some memories in Erskine's heart. As the developer of the super soldier serum, Abraham Erskine knew its danger and what side effects it had. "I have already created a devil, and I don't want to create any more." Therefore, Erskine was always looking for a suitable candidate to be the next super soldier who would misuse his powers and understand mercy. "Yes, and his name is Steve Rogers." Luke pulled Steve over and said, "My friend here really wishes to fight for our country. Although his physique is only subpar, his sense of patriotism is like never seen before." "Oh." Erskine nodded with a thoughtful look and left the scene. The female officer didn't stay any longer and also followed him, but she looked suspiciously at Luke before leaving. While soldiers stayed back to investigate the scene and clean up the mess. Luke, who were they? Steve, who survived the incident, had no idea about what had happened. Luke curled his lips and softly said while patting his thin shoulders, "Someone who could change your destiny. I didn't expect that I would enter the military's radar in this way. I am afraid that Peggy Carter will carefully investigate my background." But he was not worried that the Office of Strategic Services is destined to find nothing. Their enemy was Hydra, and Luke had absolutely no relationship with the so-called German spies and assassins sent by the Hydra. All that just now was terrible. Steve, who still didn't have much idea of what had happened, still had some lingering fears. The conscription station officer who was arguing with him earlier was now in a pool of blood. His hollow eyes had lost all the color as blood seeped out of his forehead due to the bullet lodged inside his head. If you step on the battlefield, you will encounter more of such things and witness even more dead partners. Luke sighed. He had watched Uncle Frank clean the houses. He even personally solved some troubling gangsters. He had long been accustomed to blood and death. Do I even have a chance to go to the war? Steve is a little frustrated. He has suffered a lot of rejections. Everywhere he went, everyone he met, only had one reply, that he won't be able to do it, and he should stay back. Even his best friend Bucky was no exception. There will be a chance. Luke nodded lightly. He seemed more confident than Steve himself. Feeling Steve's puzzled gaze on himself, Luke changed the subject and dragged him out of the conscription station. All right, let's go find Bucky. We need to enjoy our time while we three are still together. Chapter 10, Chapter 010 Seeing Uncle Frank. T/N, hey guys, thank you for being awesome. Here's the extra chapter as promised. Albeit a bit late. The next day, Luke got up early from the bed, prepared himself for a new day, and continued his daily training to become like a certain bald guy from his previous life. Push-ups, squats, sit-ups, running. By the time he had finished his exercise routine, it was already past 8:30. Bucky should have boarded the ship. Luke headed out to meet Rogers. They had planned to send off Bucky, but Sergeant James Barnes, who was heading for England, didn't allow them and said he may get a bit emotional. His last night was amazing, with a well-ironed military uniform and some cheesy lines. Bucky was able to pick up some pretty girls. Good morning, Luke. The flower shop owner downstairs looked enthusiastic and continued loudly, Frank is looking for you, he seemed angry about something. All right, thanks, Uncle Doll. Luke stopped, changed directions, and walked towards his Uncle Frank's house. Probably it was due to yesterday's street gangster, who must have gone to complain to his boss, and then news came to his uncle through the Irish gang. 10 minutes later, Luke took out the key from under the doormat and opened the door. Uncle Frank, I brought you roasted mushrooms and hash browns from Aunt Bertha's. Carrying a rich, steaming breakfast, Luke walked into the living room and saw an old man with grey hair and a rickety waist. Even from his weak and shallow figure, one can easily see the tough and strong shadow of his youth. Luke. You annoying kid. Seeing Luke, the old man cursed angrily. That son of a bitch Hobson went to complain Mr. Hoffer again, saying that you beat up his little brother. Hobson had to tell Mr. Hoffer even this kind of thing. He didn't tell Mr. Hoffer when his mother died while sitting in the toilet, last week. Luke pretended to be surprised. Without hesitating, he took out the plates, knives and forks from the cupboard. Eat while it's hot. Aunt Bertha especially added meat for you in these hash browns. The old man named Frank sat at the table and said, Don't try to buy me with this, Luke, you messy bastard. That Italian guy last night, oh wow, this is awesome. So fucking tasty. No matter how much I eat it, I will never get tired of this. Well, it turns out that good food can calm down anyone's temper. After Frank ate his fill, he didn't mention Hobson or his younger brother. What he did do was persuade Luke to join the rapidly growing Irish gang. Mr. Hoffer values you very much. That idea of doing business with the barracks was good, it allowed the gang to get their hands on some guns, or else we would have been long eliminated. Those Italians aren't arrogant anymore. Frank couldn't understand why his nephew didn't wish to join the gang. Other street gangsters of Brooklyn would do anything to join the gang and become one of them. Because no one would mess with them with the gang behind them. Luke made himself a cup of coffee and with a light smile, he replied, Not interested. It would be better to go back to school than be a gangster. He knew that this was the most turbulent period in American history, as the newspapers said, violence. It is as American as cherry pie. With the start of the World War, various gangs had sprung up continuously. At first, most of them were poor immigrant groups, such as Irish and Italians. Unlike the British and Germans immigrants, who came with large amounts of money to settle in North America, these immigrants were destitute. In fact, they are called immigrants because they keep on changing their places and continue to be people at the bottom. Many people can't even rent houses and could only do manual labor to fend themselves. These immigrant groups had gradually formed slums. This was also how the Hell's Kitchen of New York was born. A philosopher once said, "Nationalism often places the poverty of the country at its heart, making it basically a critique." Because the Irish and Italians are both Catholics themselves, they were regarded as boorish, incapable of settling down in North America, which was dominated by Protestants. The ever-present exclusion and discrimination made life difficult for these immigrant groups. Therefore, in order to fight against the exploitation of labor and religious persecution, the Irish and Italians slowly formed various violent groups. This was the embryonic form of the American gang. Chapter 11, Chapter 011 Rising Momentum of Gangs. The gangs at that time were just a group of poor people, and they weren't taken seriously by anyone. It was not until later that special groups called families began to emerge. They were professionals that came into being after the rise of the industrial society, and their main responsibility is to raise campaign funds for political party candidates and to buy votes for their elections. In the past, no one would have valued those immigrant groups because of their low status and poverty. But the families keenly discovered their value, and the gangs formed by the workers at the beginning gradually changed. One got loads of rum to drink, and the other provided stable votes to politicians. The two sides hit it off. However, no one expected the follow-up development. Prohibition provided a lot of wealth to these gangs. Coupled with the rise of labor unions, labor movements also became frequent. Prohibition was a nationwide ban on the sale and import of alcoholic beverages that lasted from 1920 to 1933. But its smuggling gave a lot of wealth to the gangs and families. These gangsters had finally found a place in the social order. On one hand they had loads of wealth, while on the other they had the backing of politicians because of their power to generate votes. All this played a big role in the rise of gangsters. Like the Irish gang which Uncle Frank was part of, they had a very close relationship with the senior executive of the National Brotherhood of Truck Drivers, Mr. Jimmy Hoffa. Editor note, Teamsters. This union represented nearly 1 million truck drivers and warehouse workers, and later reached 2.3 million members at its peak. It can be said that if one was running for mayor or councillor and if they can get help from the union, then it was already a win for them. Gangs, labor unions, and politicians come together in a tight chain of interests. It's a pity that this glory won't last long. Luke silently mulled over it. Whether it is Irish or Italian, their power was only temporary. Even if the former succeeded in electing Kennedy as the president, and the latter had close ties with Edgar Hoover, the first director of the FBI. It was just that the gangsters are, after all, a deformed product of social order. With the end of World War II, they will inevitably decline and will be reduced to tools in the hands of politicians and the rich. It would be difficult to regain the glory of the past. In Marvel, a gangster has no future. Even if he becomes a godfather or family head. These were Luke's inner thoughts. Seeing Luke's indifferent look, Frank finally lost his cool. "Why are you so stubborn? Can't you just do what I ask? Join the gang and you will have a secure future, you will be able to take my seat. Why don't you want to? Stop wasting your life." The world won't accept you for nothing. He had a good relationship with Mr. Jimmy Hoffa of the National Brotherhood of Truck Drivers, and he didn't wish to ruin it. After retiring, he may get a seat as the honorary president at a branch in the union. Although it was just a position with no power, he was going to get a good salary every month. If Luke joined the gang, then there was a chance that Mr. Hoffa may help out Luke in settling in his life. "Uncle Frank, don't worry about me. Here, cover yourself with a blanket, it's still cold outside." Luke didn't refute, and put a thick blanket on Frank's legs with a grin. If he followed Captain America and joined the Howling Commandos, he might really be a war hero. Unfortunately, even if one becomes a hero, he is still a tool or a mascot in the eyes of politicians and the rich. So Luke had another idea. Meanwhile, at a military camp somewhere in New York, in the conference room, the female officer is reporting about the incident at the conscription station to her boss. "Colonel Phillips, I think that guy named Luke Cavill has a problem." Chapter 12, Chapter 012 The Decision by the Strategic Scientific Reserve. Somewhere in a military camp, New York. In the conference room, the gallant female officer was briefing her superior. "Colonel Phillips, I think there is something wrong with that Luke Cavill guy." Carter briefly summarized the attack that Dr. Erskine encountered near the World Expo of Tomorrow's venue and then talked about Luke, who was listed among the suspects. "I've seen the wounds on the German spies, all of them were one shot. Ordinary people can't do this. Cavill must have practiced marksmanship and is quite good at it." The female officer concluded with certainty in her tone. After leaving the conscription station, the doubts in her mind never went away. That young guy from Brooklyn single-handedly killed more than one professionally trained spies. It felt unbelievable. There were too many things that didn't make sense. Therefore, Carter believed it was likely a plot by Hydra. By sacrificing those German spies, they wanted to get close to Dr. Erskine. Then, they will implement their evil plan. Germany preferred kidnapping more than killing Dr. Erskine. The value of super soldier serum just couldn't be neglected. Whoever obtained it will be able to influence the course of the World War. Such threat and potential just can't be ignored. Colonel Phillips, who was sitting in his seat, shook his head and whispered, "He's not a problem. I've sent someone to investigate Luke Cavill. His parents were Irish immigrants, died very early. The administration took pity on him, and he had excellent grades and was academically gifted. He was even offered a scholarship every year, but he later dropped out of high school after he turned 17. Why did he drop out of school?" Carter was puzzled. "You should know that Irish immigrants aren't well received. It is very common to be bullied and discriminated against. As a result, Cavill often fought with other students at school. When the teachers encountered this, they had to call his parents, but well, he had no parents." Colonel Phillips shrugged his shoulders and helplessly said, "After fighting the bullies, he still had to deal with unreasonable adults. For a 17-year-old, it wasn't something easy to deal with." Carter went silent. She can imagine how difficult those years were for Luke Cavill, who was an orphan. But, where did he get the gun, and how did he learn marksmanship? Carter hesitantly asked. Through the colonel's account, she dispelled her inner suspicions. However, Carter didn't understand how an ordinary young man in Brooklyn could shoot with such precision. Cavill's uncle, Frank, is a veteran, the kind that actually survived from the battlefield through combat. He went on to join the Irish gangs and did some dirty work. Now, he's about to retire as the honorary president of one of the truck drivers' union branches. Colonel Phillips informed her about the results of the investigation. He knew that Carter had always been competitive and good at her job. It's just that she was somewhat obsessed with showing that she wasn't inferior to any male. Sometimes, Colonel Phillips had a headache due to this. He wouldn't have had such a good temper if the other party hadn't been a Brit and wasn't a faction of the American military. After all, the Strategic Scientific Reserve had very diverse members, with talented people recruited from all over the world and of all genders. Carter was one of them. Luke Cavill isn't a German spy. He has nothing to do with the Germans. I don't think Hitler, no matter how capable he is in provoking people, could make a young man who grew up in Brooklyn turn into a spy for Germany. Sure, Cavill did do some underhand stuff, but the Strategic Scientific Reserve isn't interested in those, and interfering gang fights isn't our job. We're against the Hydra, and winning this war by defeating the Axis is our aim. Colonel Phillips emphasized the last part, instructing her to stop nagging him about Luke. He didn't want Carter to stir up this hornet's nest, which the Irish gangs were. Those people had now joined forces with the unions and helped politicians gather votes and interfere with the elections. In recent years, their power had increased exponentially. Even Colonel Phillips didn't wish to provoke such unnecessary trouble. God knows how many Capitol Hill lawyers were standing behind them. Instead, he seemed to think of something and said, "Erskine seemed to be very interested in those two. Luke Cavill, and what's the name of the other guy?" "Steve Rogers," Carter replied. Yes. Erskine wants to take them both and recruit them to Campley High." Colonel Phillips pondered for a moment and asked, "What do you think of this, Carter?" Campley High, on the surface, was a place to train recruits. However, the real purpose was to select test subjects to be injected with the super soldier serum. Erskine's intention was undoubtedly to get Luke Cavill and Steve Rogers selected. Colonel Phillips didn't think there was any problem with the former. Luke was tall and strong, and he could even take care of 3 German spies all by himself. Even if he wasn't selected in the end, it doesn't change the fact that he would become a good soldier. But Steve Rogers, that small, skinny guy, looked like he could be blown away just by a gust of wind. It would be ridiculous if the Allies had to be saved by such a guy. If this is Dr. Erskine's idea, then I think it's fine, Colonel. Carter thought for a moment and answered, "Well then, I'll leave the matter to you. I want to see them on the bus to New Jersey." Colonel Phillips nodded and handed off the assignment. He figured, anyway, with Rogers' physique, he probably wouldn't even make it through basic training for the recruits. As for being selected and becoming a super soldier. Chapter 13, Chapter 013 Candidates for the Super Soldier Serum, I. *****. Luke, who had returned to his room, opened the door. Outside, he found Rogers standing with the frosty-looking female officer. He couldn't help but ask in surprise, "What's going on, Steve?" He thought that the Strategic Scientific Reserve would investigate him and perhaps even drag him in for questioning in the name of assistance. As an important person protected by the military, Abraham Erskine gave them the perfect reason to do anything they wanted. "Steve, what are you so happy about?" It seemed like he wasn't able to hold back his smile. Was being dragged in for interrogation something to be happy about? "Luke, I can now join the army. We will leave for New Jersey tomorrow." Steve was so happy that he was almost shouting while giving him the news. His days of depression were finally over. Luke's eyebrows trembled a bit when he heard what Steve just said. They decided to recruit us. Despite the changes in the plot, Steve Rogers was still on the road to becoming Captain America, just like the original timeline. I thought the process would be a little more complicated. Luke collected his emotions and regained his composure. It seemed that the plan to obtain the super soldier serum had completed its first stage. Luke Cavill, are you willing to serve your country and bring us honor on the battlefield against the Axis? Carter asked coldly. As if I have the right to refuse. Luke looked at the two soldiers with live ammunition standing behind Carter and thought silently. Since I chose to enter the military's radar and have already aroused Dr. Erskine's interest. At this moment, there was no turning back. Since the organization has already made the decision, Luke resisted the urge to say something patriotic on the spot and just accepted the military draft. The next day, early morning. Luke, now drafted in the military, packed up his luggage and went with Rogers, who was more than just excited, to take a special military truck to Cambley High in New Jersey. Before leaving, they met several important personnel from the Strategic Scientific Reserve. For example, the serious-looking Colonel Phillips. The creator of the super soldier serum, Dr. Abraham Erskine. Howard Stark, who was well known in New York. And of course, Agent Carter, who still had a cold expression. And so on. The Strategic Scientific Reserve was a temporary organization specially established by the Allies to win the war. It was personally approved by President Roosevelt and the heads of the European countries. The main purpose of such gathering elites from various fields was to fight against the Third Reich's Hydra, a certain evil organization symbolized by the monster Hydra. The secondary purpose was to implement the super soldier plan and to end the war which was sweeping through the world. The current leader of Hydra is Johann Schmidt, nicknamed Red Skull. He was said to be a member of Hitler's inner circle. His authority was so high that he was one of the people whose approval led to the formation of the secret police in Germany. Red Skull isn't the one who founded the Hydra. Luke thought as he sat on a military truck, swaying from side to side. He remembered the cartoons mentioning that the origin of the original Hydra was quite early enough to go back even further. Red Skull just used this name. There were some similarities between him and his idol, Adolf Hitler. Luke, do you think we would meet Bucky? Rogers asked, clutching his bag. Thinking of Bucky's surprised expression when he finds out that they have joined the army and set foot on the battlefield, he couldn't help looking forward to their next meeting. Luke laughed and said, Bucky should have already reached England and may even be fighting in the war as we talk. He could understand why Rogers was so obsessed with serving in the army. For a long time, this little man had been made fun of and bullied because of his thin figure. In such cases, the future only followed two paths. Some people, like Rogers, maintained an optimistic and positive attitude, while others developed distrust and self-imposed apathy. The former are few and far between, while the latter are numerous. And this was probably why Steve Rogers became Captain America. He was a man who always had a positive approach to things. Rogers was keen to serve in the army, not out of strong patriotic feelings. He wasn't the kind of a person who was eager to get some military honors and medals. This skinny little guy is trying to prove that he was no different than the stronger guys. Luke, why did Howard Stark go to Cambley High? Was he also drafted as a soldier? Rogers asked with a curious face. He didn't know anything about the super soldier plan or the Strategic Scientific Reserve. He only thought that they went to Cambley High to receive training for new recruits. Stark isn't the same as us, he's a scientific consultant. A full-fledged senior officer. Luke shook his head. As two new recruits, how could they compare to Howard Stark? Both sides were treated differently. Howard Stark was able to take a smooth and comfortable private car and talk and laugh with a group of senior officers along the way. In the evening, he might even go out and have fun. While he and Rogers had to stay in the military truck that rocked like a lurching ship. Luke smiled meaningfully. Get ready to live like a soldier, Rogers. For Rogers, who was far from strong, recruit training is no easy task. Chapter 14, Chapter 014 Candidates for the Super Soldier Serum, 2. A week later. Steve, are you all right? Luke, who finished the rucking, handed a towel to the thin little man. T-note, rucking equals walking a long trail with a weighted rucksack. He looked like he had been fished out of the water, and his military camouflage was soaked with sweat. His chest was heaving up and down heavily, as if pulling the bellows, emitting a heavy huffing and puffing sound. Even the easiest 5-kilometer rucking was an impossible challenge for Rogers that had poor physical fitness. No, it's fine. I just need a break, and I'll be fine. Luke looked at Rogers, who was talking between each breath he took, fearing that he would suddenly pass out. Steve was able to persevere until now, forced himself to stand up. He was indeed very determined. Regardless of each day's training assignment, Rogers was the last to finish and the one with the worst grades. But in terms of efforts, he wasn't inferior to others, sometimes better than others. I feel much better. Thank you, Luke. After a few breaths, Rogers thanked him with a grateful smile. If it wasn't for Luke's help, his situation would have been much worse. To Rogers, Camp Lehi was no different from the streets of Brooklyn. People relied on strong muscles and bullied the weak. Such bastards can be found everywhere. Luckily Luke came forward, otherwise Rogers would have already been beaten up more than once. Huddle up. A sharp whistle resounded, and the recruits, who had long since developed a conditioned reflex, trotted over and stood in neat formation. Some of them had learned the hard way about what happened when they disobeyed orders, or what happened when someone acted like a prick. That cold-faced female officer with a British accent wasn't as weak as she looked. The recruit who took the punch, Gilmer Hodge, was very vocal about this. He still had a band-aid over his nose bridge. What's more, high-intensity physical training every day was enough to release everyone's extra energy. By the end of the day they were too tired to create trouble. From the report over the last few weeks, which recruit has the best scores and the best performance? Standing not far away, looking at the new recruits being lectured, Colonel Phillips asked. It's Luke Cavill. Carter, who was holding the score sheet, raised an eyebrow. She really didn't expect the answer to be the young man from Brooklyn. Not only was his marksmanship amazing, but his performance in other test subjects were excellent. Shooting targets, marching with weight, climbing barbed wire and other physical training. Luke could easily win the first place and left the one who was placed second, far behind. I knew it. Erskine, as I said, Cavill is the most suitable candidate. Colonel Phillips said as he clapped his hands. He looked at Luke, the strong, sturdy man in the lineup, with admiration in his eyes. The other party perfectly conformed to the definition and image of a good soldier in the colonel's mind. Wait. We still have time. Dr. Erskine, who was standing nearby, replied. His eyes didn't stop at Luke, but looked at Rogers, who stood out in the lineup. If they were to choose a big strong man as the super soldier, Then there was no need for Erskine to start this secret selection at all. Just pick anyone out of the army. In this world, there had never been a shortage of good soldiers who knew how to obey orders and had strong muscles. However, it was quite difficult to find a truly good person. They needed a super soldier who had strength but will never misuse it. Erskine knew he didn't have much time, but he still chose to be patient and think carefully. He had high hopes from Rogers. That thin little guy has a rare quality that touches people's hearts. You asked me to look into Rogers' life. Yes, he is indeed a good man. But what's that going to do? If the bureaucrats of the committee know that the choice for super soldier was a thin guy who was as skinny as a piece of wood and can't even finish a 5 kilometers run, what will they think? Colonel Phillips said with discontent. In his opinion, war was a matter of comparing the strength of both sides, not the character of the soldiers. The selection isn't over, time is not up yet. Colonel, let's wait patiently for a little longer. Dr. Erskine ended the conversation. But this time, his eyes were on to Luke. Chapter 15, Chapter 0152 Soldiers, 1 Serum. Before going, Dr. Erskine said as he looked at the training soldiers, General Patton once said, wars might be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. We can definitely win this war because we have the best soldiers. The Strategic Scientific Reserve is composed of various national allies. The best and brightest of the free world have gathered here. Our goal is to build the most powerful army, ever. And every army has a leader. By next week, we will choose that person. And after a moment of silence, he continued, he will be the first super soldier. And he will send Adolf Hitler to hell with his own hands. At the end of the 2-week training program for recruits, Colonel Phillips finally revealed the super soldier selection program to the recruits. He held Carter's score sheet in his hand and looked over at the tall and well-built Luke. As expected, this young man from Brooklyn was still excellent in his performance. Judging from the physical quality and the comprehensive results from various training programs, he was a well-deserved first place among the recruits of Camp Lehi. This is the super soldier our country needs. Colonel Phillips was very satisfied with the results. But when his eyes accidentally landed on the thin and weak Rogers, he couldn't help but sigh. Despite the fact that the other party trained seriously and never slacked off, his naturally weak physique made it very difficult for him to become a competent soldier. I really don't know what Erskine is thinking. Colonel Phillips was a little annoyed. He was under pressure from the committee and the White House's watchful eye. If the super soldier couldn't satisfy the military, then his career would very well be over. It was important to know that various countries had invested a lot of manpower and resources to set up the Strategic Scientific Reserve. Now, everyone was waiting for the result. After the meeting, the recruits were dismissed. However, the recruits had half expected who was going to be selected and were bootlicking him. Boss Luke. Your performance should be the best of all the new recruits. You should be the super soldier. Back at the barracks, Gilmer Hodge, who had been lectured by Carter, was one of such people. He was considered a mob character in the original plot. He often bullied the skinny Rogers, because of his large size and hard punches. However, this time due to Luke, things were different. Hodge, who felt satisfaction by bullying the weak, suffered the first defeat in his life. On the night before arriving at Camp Lehi, Hodge tried to make fun of Rogers, but Luke stuffed his head into the toilet. He thought his fists were hard enough, but Luke, who had beaten gangsters, cut down gangs and painted houses, had a lot of real-life experience. It was like a sheep meeting a lion, it was a one-sided massacre. Since then, no one among the trainees would dare to mess with the Brooklyn duo. Hodge, who was stuffed into the toilet, became Luke's faithful gopher. He would follow him around every day, calling him boss. Just like a bootlicker. Luke once wondered if this guy had masochistic tendencies, or if his brain was filled with water when he was stuffed in the toilet. T-note, head / brain filled with water equals became an idiot. However, he later realized that bullies like Hodge, who were afraid of bullying and bullied people, often believed in the simple thinking that the strong have the last say. Therefore, it was normal for him to act like this. All in all, Luke seems to have turned on the King of Soldiers template and had managed to dominate the entire camp high without realizing it. T-note, template / character template equals it's where you define your character's race, backstory, appearance, abilities, goals and flaws, everything you'll need to successfully place them in your game / story. For example, a character card. Colonel Phillips not only praised Luke, but he was hailed everywhere he went in the barracks. Use your head and think about it. If the conditions for selecting super soldiers were training results and strong muscles, then couldn't the military just pick someone from the army? Luke didn't treat Hodge differently just because this guy bootlicked a lot. Yes, Boss Luke has a point. Hodge had a smile as he cleaned the barracks. Steve, don't be discouraged. I can see Dr. Erskine thinks highly of you. Ignoring the fawning Hodge, Luke walked up to Rogers. The future Captain America is somewhat depressed right now. When he saw Luke's excellent performance and thought of his poor performance, he was inevitably a little depressed. I wasn't thinking about becoming a super soldier. But I'm starting to wonder if my choice to join the military and serve was the right choice. Maybe Bucky had a point. If you aren't destined to do something, giving up is also a kind of courage. Rogers sounded like he had reached a new low point in his life, and his tone was full of doubt towards himself. Through these days of training, he finally realized how weak he was. I don't think so. Dr. Erskine saw you and drafted you into the military, so he surely found some good qualities in you that are worth considering. Confidence, that's the secret to success. Don't be defeated by a momentary setback. A character of gold is worth more than strong muscles. Luke brought up a steaming bowl of chicken soup for the soul, filling Roger's eyes with light and fighting spirit. T-note, chicken soup for the soul equals speech / story intended to encourage someone to make more effort or to think more positively. If he kept up the good work and said a few more inspirational sayings from the future, perhaps Captain America would regard him as a spiritual mentor. So, it was possible to learn something by reading some marketing mottos. Luke breathed a sigh of relief when he saw Rogers's mood slowly return to normal. After all, Captain America was an important part of his plan. During the 2-week training for recruits, Luke unapologetically distinguished himself and achieved excellent results. And he did that obviously for the super soldier serum. It was just that. However, he didn't wish to wear the Star-Spangled Banner uniform and take Captain America's place. Even if I become a super soldier, I will inevitably be regarded as a mascot by politicians. I don't want to perform on stage and debut as an idol. Luke's thinking is very clear. The military researched the super soldier serum. The real purpose was to form an invincible and powerful army. In this way, they could march into Berlin and end the war. According to the development of the original plot, Dr. Erskine will be assassinated, the only sample will also be destroyed, and the formula for the super soldier serum will be lost forever. Roger's usefulness at war, as the only super soldier, was at most as an mascot to promote buying of war bonds. That was what the politicians thought. If Luke replaced Rogers and donned the Stars and Stripes uniform, his ending would probably be similar. Suppose he did it differently and saved Dr. Erskine. The next step would be the mass production of super soldiers. Luke still wouldn't have any future, because he would no longer be the special one. Therefore, after much consideration, Luke decided to show his excellent side and strived to win Colonel Phillips' admiration and put more pressure on Dr. Erskine. With two suitable candidates, the story may progress differently. Chapter 16, Chapter 016 Dr. Erskine's Decision. At dusk, Erskine went looking for Luke, who was resting in the barracks. The German scientist didn't beat around the bush and explained the reason for his arrival. Colonel Phillips thinks you're the best candidate for super soldier. What do you think, Luke? Feeling that scrutinizing gaze, Luke kept his calm. After a moment of thought, he replied without hesitating, what a super soldier needs to possess is not just a strong body, rather, it's knowing compassion and having a good heart. He could see that Dr. Erskine was testing him. Rogers was always the right person in the other party's mind. After the Red Skull incident, the German scientist had a bit of trauma. Even if Luke performed well, Erskine wasn't as impressed as he was by Rogers' words at the recruiting station. Erskine pushed the glasses on the bridge of his nose and asked with a hesitant tone, "Who do you think meets such conditions in the camp?" "My friend Steve Rogers. His character is most trustworthy." Luke's eyes were determined, as if he was inwardly convinced of this. Hearing this satisfactory answer, Erskine's last doubt disappeared without a trace. Originally, he was suspicious of Luke's involvement in the gangs and the high probability that he had blood on his hands. He was afraid that if the other party became a super soldier, he would be like Red Skull and completely lose his sense of humanity. Because of the effectiveness of the serum, that is what would happen. Very good. Erskine patted Luke on the shoulder and smiled approvingly. Originally, he and Colonel Phillips had very different ideas, and neither could convince the other. Luke's answer completely dispelled Erskine's doubts. He spoke solemnly, "You will both be super soldiers." Next week, Luke and Rogers left Camp Lehi and boarded a car for New York. As for the trained recruits, they became reserve soldiers. If the serum injection is successful, everyone has a chance to become a super soldier. "I never thought we would be back in Brooklyn so soon," Rogers lamented. He sat next to Luke, looking through the window, gazing at the familiar buildings. "So, the Colonel was right, fortune favors the foolish," Luke joked. When Rogers learned that he had been selected as a test subject for the super soldier, he couldn't wait to find Luke to share it, only to see Colonel Phillips in the barracks. The latter, with a look of disgust, glanced at Rogers and uttered this phrase. Remembering that incident, Rogers didn't feel bad but rather had an earnest expression, "This isn't good luck. It's all thanks to you and Dr. Erskine. I couldn't have made it this far without your help." He heard from Colonel Phillips that Luke had recommended him to Dr. Erskine on his own initiative. Although Rogers wasn't very good at expressing his emotions, he remembered this gratitude in his heart. "If you were a woman, I might have accepted your gratitude." Luke made a disgusted face and snickered, "See that block, that alley, and the parking lot out there, those are your old battlefields." Rogers lowered his head and smiled awkwardly. He had been beaten a lot because he couldn't get rid of his nosy habit. These battlefields were actually the places where he had been beaten before. "Did you have something against running away?" Carter, who was sitting in the front and driving, asked. She was the entourage this time and was responsible for getting Luke and Rogers safely to their destination. You start running, they'll never let you stop. If you stand up and fight back, you will have the opportunity to defeat them one day. Rogers spoke of his inner feelings, and Carter was a bit moved by his sincere tone. Dr. Erskine didn't choose him for no reason. At least this courage is worthy of praise. Being underestimated is something I have often experienced. Carter seemed to be drawn by the idea and said a few more words in a rare moment. On normal days in Camp Lehi, this female officer was like an iceberg, keeping people away. Even the notorious playboy Howard Stark would be careful around her. So far, not one dinner invitation was accepted. Miss Carter, I don't understand why you want to join the army. You are a beautiful lady. Rogers glanced at Carter and began to speak with the emotional intelligence of a straight man. You know, what the other party hated most is when people say she's too good-looking to be an agent in this line of work. T-note, straight man equals slang word, it's not about their sexuality, it means awkwardly sexist males that don't understand women at all. Carter had a strong character and had never thought that she would lose to any man in terms of ability. Seeing that Rogers was about to anger her, Luke hastily intervened by asking, "How much longer until we get there?" "Soon." Carter glanced at Rogers coldly, snorted, and stopped talking. The latter looked innocent, not knowing where he was wrong. "Rogers, your ability to talk to women is among the worst I've ever seen." Luke shook his head and whispered in low voice. The car remained quiet for the rest of the journey. About 20 minutes or so, they arrived at their destination. The trio stepped out of the car and pushed open the door of an antique shop. Yes, this was the secret base of the Strategic Scientific Reserve. Carter exchanged coats with an older woman and led Luke and Rogers into the inner room. What a cliché design. Luke looked at the shelves full of books. Entering the interior of the base, each door is guarded by heavily armed soldiers. From time to time, some researchers in white coats would walk by with files in their hands. Rogers, who was seeing this kind of scene for the first time, was a little nervous. Chapter 17, Chapter 017 Marvel Superman. Rogers looked at Luke, as they walked side by side. He found him to be calm and relaxed. That's so like him. Rogers thought to himself. Actually, Luke's true emotions were far less calm than they seemed. From Brooklyn streets, step by step to the Strategic Scientific Reserve secret base, and about to receive the super soldier serum injection. This wasn't an easy task. In order to get the plug-in, I went on desperately. T-note, plug-in equals component that adds a specific feature to an existing character template. The three went down to the bottom floor and saw two metal coffin-like boxes in the middle of the room, where Dr. Erskine and Howard Stark were talking about something. Colonel Phillips and the senators who were in attendance stayed in the control room on the second floor. Everyone was looking forward to witness a miracle. Let's get started, Dr. Erskine said to the two men. Luke and Rogers looked at each other, and took off their garrison caps and coats. The contrast between their physiques was obvious. The former is strong and well-defined, while the latter is as thin as dry wood. Seeing that, the researchers around them shook their heads and sighed. They doubted whether Rogers could survive the serum injection. It's okay, you can do it. Luke squeezed Rogers' shoulder as if to inject courage into him. If Steve wasn't around, he would be the one to debut as an idol and sell war bonds. Seeing him nod in agreement, Luke turned his attention to what was before him, a metal box with complex wires and cables inserted on both sides. Howard Stark, who sported a mustache, was in charge of operating the machine. He was currently at the console, busy with the preparation for the serum injection. This talented millionaire, who had good relations with the military elites under the banner of patriotism, was also one of the participants in this project. Click. A bright light flashed as the staff from the military's public affairs department snapped a photo of Luke and Rogers standing together. This was a memorable historical moment. It's time to start. Erskine cleared the people, leaving only Howard Stark and other researchers. You'll both make it, the doctor seriously said. He was only going to choose one person to make a super soldier. However, Luke's outstanding performance and sincere attitude made Erskine's original idea waver. So, he and Colonel Phillips each took a step back. It was decided that both of these candidates would be injected with the serum and become super soldiers. In the words of Colonel Phillips, at least one will succeed. Dr. Erskine patiently explained the process, and then the shells of the two metal boxes placed together slowly closed. It will start out as a series of minimally invasive injections to inject the serum into the muscle groups. After this step is completed, it will trigger radical changes in the cells. Luke was plunged into darkness, unable to see the slightest bit of light from the outside world. He could only hear Dr. Erskine's voice talking to Howard Stark. The cold needles pierced his skin, and the serum was steadily pushed into the body, which merged with countless cells. Weird, I don't feel much pain. Luke was worried that the process of injecting the super soldier serum would be extremely painful. At least in his memory, Rogers shouted at the top of his lungs and almost died. Start the instrument. Luke heard Dr. Erskine's voice. The metal instrument connected to the cable introduced a sizzling strong current. A burst of white light broke out. Fuck. Luke instantly felt intensively excruciating pain, as if his muscle fibers were pulled into a million strips. His whole body felt like it was torn apart. Not only the physical, but the mental strain was just as unbearable. However, the intense pain, enough to make people crazy, only lasted a short moment. Then, as if it was absorbed, it just disappeared. 100%. On his retina, clear data emerged. The progress bar, which had been stagnant for years, had finally completely loaded. Player identity cleared. Gift pack is being issued. Issued successfully. Please check. Lines of information flew out. Then, the hazy white light slightly lit up. A huge stream of data, like a waterfall, scrolled down to form a character panel. Host, Luke Cavill. Loaded card, none. Ability, none. Reputation, none. Task list, not yet opened. Luke felt a bit puzzled. After working so hard for so long, he only got 3 empty stats. Forget it, let's first open the gift pack. Luke was familiar with it and clicked on the conscious space. Open. With a slight thought, a golden shimmering light erupted. Many characters poured into his mind. Golden Superman. Silver Superman. Cyborg Superman. Quantum Superman. Ultraman. Superboy Prime. Various forms of Superman templates are displayed in front of Luke's eyes. Superman card detected, would you like to accept it? Chapter 18, Chapter 018 Marvel Superman, 2. Superman card detected, would you like to accept it? Yes. Would you like to don the cape? No. Loading succeeded. Luke opened character panel again. Host, Luke Cavill. Loaded card, Superman, LV1. Abilities, Stellar Energy, passive, Bioforce Field, passive. Reputation, none. Task list, not yet opened. Then, rows and rows of specific information representing his physical data flooded into his brain. A few minutes ago, Colonel Phillips was in the control room exchanging some words with Senator Brandt, one of the members of the committee. "I'm glad you can come, Senator," the colonel said with a smile. With his temper, he was unwilling to deal with politicians. Because these guys were too hypocritical. Always smiling, but secretly thinking about getting their own benefits. This made Colonel Phillips, who came from a military background and attached great importance to the overall situation, uncomfortable. But as the executive of the Strategic Scientific Reserve and a participant in the Super Soldier program, he had to learn to socialize with politicians. After all, research funding and allocated resources need to be approved by the committee. "Is that the super soldier you chose? My God. He looks like he hasn't eaten for days." Senator Brandt stood in the control room on the second floor, looking down. He was surprised to see the short and thin Rogers. This was a little different from the super soldier the committee wanted. Rogers is a backup to prevent failure. "Senator, have you seen him, Luke Cavill? That's the best soldier I've ever seen." Colonel Phillips looked embarrassed and pointed to Luke, who was standing beside Luke. He wasn't optimistic about Rogers. The fact that the other party was here was the result of Dr. Erskine's insistence on going his own way. A lot of departments are applying for funding at this stage, but the budget allocated to Strategic Scientific Reserve is always the largest. "Colonel, don't let the president down." Senator Brandt knocked back a comment and sat down with an accompanying reporter. His willingness to attend wasn't motivated by a love of science. Instead, he wanted to take the credit for it in the first place. Senator Brandt was keenly aware of the marketing value of a super soldier. It doesn't matter whether they could change the war or not, attracting the attention of the public was the key. 5 minutes later, the experiment and serum injection were in its final stage. The power switches of the two metal boxes had crossed 70%. A dazzling white light flashed, almost drowning the surrounding space. An intense painful roar came from one of the metal boxes. It was Rogers. The process of injecting the serum was like a million knives to him, viciously cutting every cell and every nerve in his body. In particular, as the value of energy transmission increased, the more violent the transformation he endured, greater the physical and mental pain he suffered. "Steve." Erskine's right hand twitched. The serum injection might cause the death of the test subject. It was something that everyone knew quite well. Only the one who made it through could become a super soldier. But it seems that Rogers couldn't withstand it. "Colonel, what's going on?" Senator Brandt asked, tilting his head. Looking at the two identical metal boxes, with subjects injected with the same serum. Why is Rogers so agonized, while Luke isn't even responding? Don't tell me he was injected with a fake serum. Faced with Senator Brandt's suspicion, Colonel Phillips could only shrug his shoulders with an equally puzzled expression. Subsequent cards need to rely on reputation to unlock. It's just like when I played the game. Luke, lying in the metal instrument, didn't know the changes in the outside world. He digested the vast amount of information received by his brain and began to understand how the so-called card should be used. First of all, there was the level setting given by the character panel. According to different levels, the game divided Kryptonians into 6 levels. LV1, Civilian. LV2, Soldier. LV3, Captain. LV4, General. LV5, Counselor. LV6, Monarch. Every time he upgraded, he would also be able to get items that were exclusively from Krypton. For example, the Fortress of Solitude, the Codex and other key items. And the Superman card I have now is Civilian. In terms of both overall quality and ability, for the time being, I am as good as the genuine Superman. Luke looked at the many cards that were grayed out, while pursing his lips. Unfortunately, there were no other unlocked cards. The plugin he received was essentially a game panel. Similar to a game, he needed to follow the pattern of gaining reputation, grinding levels, and completing daily tasks. Clark Kent was a natural-born Kryptonian with infinite potential. As for General Zod, who was also a Kryptonian, he was an innate general, and his rank should be in LV4 or LV5. Luke's thought of the two of the most impressive Kryptonians. Although he was only the lowest LV1 civilian right now, it was enough. The Kryptonian body is basically a solar battery, and as long as it absorbs the stellar energy of the bright sun, its physical stats will continue to get stronger. However, he just wanted to have unlimited potential, like the real Superman. He had to work hard to gain reputation, grind levels and increase his levels. After, it was impossible to turn into the Golden Superman just by sunbathing. Chapter 19, Chapter 019 The Assassination. 100%. The metal box's power was turned up to maximum, the dense white light almost burned people's eyes. An electric spark broke out at the console, and Rogers, who had painfully cried out, suddenly quieted down. Erskine quickly asked Howard Stark to open the metal instrument. He temporarily ignored Luke, who didn't make a sound, to save Rogers first. A burst of white gas scattered, and everyone showed an incredible expression of shock. Steve Rogers. That scrawny little man turned into a tall and mighty captain with big pectoral muscles in the blink of an eye. He was now a totally different person. The next moment, everyone in the control room cheered and revered in jubilation, eager to immediately throw a celebration party. Senator Brandt was even more enthusiastic, screaming things like Berlin should be nervous and capture Hitler alive. In his view, with a super soldier regiment with soldiers like Rogers, the Allies were assured of victory and could win this battle without a doubt. However, Colonel Phillips, who was immersed in joy, excitement and so on, with Senator Brandt, didn't notice that one of the guests in the control room approached Dr. Erskine while no one was paying attention. "Hail Hydra!" The man who came to congratulate, quietly whispered in Dr. Erskine's ear. The latter looked up in surprise, but only saw a pair of cold eyes. "Hydra!" Dr. Erskine immediately reacted. But the man didn't give him time to call for help. A PPK was placed against the other party's chest and the trigger was pulled. Editor note, check para comment here. PPK gun. The bullet went through his heart and brought up a blood splash. Dr. Erskine felt a moment of pain, and then helplessly collapsed. The sound of gunfire echoed through the room, accompanied by calls of "Protect the Senator," as the guarding soldiers leaned over. Then, there was a loud bang in the control room. Flaming explosions swept through the scene. The strong shock wave shattered the glass windows. Colonel Phillips shielded the panic-stricken senator, while the big soldiers on guard were hit by the wave of air and crashed into the wall like a kite with broken threads. Screams, explosions, gunshots. These noises interrupted Luke's thoughts. He frowned slightly, thought for a moment, and easily broke free from his bounds, which were there to prevent the subjects from moving around and harming themselves. Crack! Bang! Luke punched through the solid shell of the metal box, ignoring the jumping electric sparks, and blatantly pulled open the iron sheet with his hands. With a crackling, tearing sound, the next moment, Luke jumped out of the metal instrument. He saw Dr. Erskine, who was shot to the ground, and Rogers, who had become taller and stronger. Senator Brand shrank back, hiding behind the cover of the crowd. And the man in the suit, suspected to be the Hydra assassin, shooting down several guards, running upstairs, and disappearing from sight. "You stay here. Protect the colonel. I'll go after him." Luke, who had jumped out of the metal box, looked around and immediately reacted to what had happened. He put on his coat and told Steve to stay back, who subconsciously nodded. He watched Luke bend his legs slightly and jump. With the Superman card and super soldier serum, his moment was like a powerful cannonball as he jumped directly from the underground room to the ground floor. Grasping the railing with one hand, with a clean and firm flip, Luke stepped on the ground. Fortunately, with the data ability provided by the character panel, he quickly got used to a lot of physical qualities which were beyond ordinary people. It wasn't like Clark in his childhood, who often faced the trouble of losing control of his ability. Under Luke's feet, the concrete cracked like spider webs due to the powerful impact. He was like a gust of wind sweeping past, raising a violent stream of air. With one thump, the ground seemed to tremble. He left like a swift arrow, leaving his blurred shadow. It had only been a few seconds since the assassin had rushed out of the corridor. The killer sent by Hydra is very clever. When he ran away, he didn't forget to destroy the button controlling the door, locking his pursuers behind him, delaying them even more. Unfortunately, for me, it's as thin as a piece of paper. Luke didn't stop or slow down. He suddenly accelerated, knocking down the thick metal door. With a bang, a clear human figure appeared on the door. "Okay. I take back what I just said, I still feel something." Luke stretched his neck side to side. He admitted that the metal door wasn't as fragile as paper, just almost to the extent of a thick wooden board. He rushed out of the secret base, coming to the booth. Luke jerked to a halt, setting off a gust of wind that blew as the bookshelves shook and swayed. When he walked out, he saw the old woman, who was the antique shop owner, had fallen to the ground, shot by 2 bullets. Outside the door, the noise of an engine starting was heard. On top of that car, the killer sent by Hydra, armed with a Thompson submachine gun, went on a rampage. Chapter 20, Chapter 020 The Chase. Heavy gunfire broke through the windows of the shop and killed several agents who were standing guard outside. The sudden and fierce gun battle caused panic among pedestrians. For fear of being affected, they covered their heads and fled, not forgetting to scream at the top of their lungs. Luke stepped out of the antique shop and was about to start his pursuit when, suddenly, the car parked in front of the entrance exploded. There was billowing fire, and shock waves, however, his figure remained standing, not wavering even the slightest. He saw the car carrying the Hydra assassin as it turned a corner and disappeared at the end of the street. Luke smiled coldly and ran after it. "Why did you make such a ruckus?" The Hydra agent who was driving the car complained. The task they received was to assassinate Abraham Erskine and destroy the super soldier plan, not to plan a terrorist attack in New York. Because once this incident blows up, they would have to pay a big price to retreat. There were 2 super soldiers and they will soon come for us. Drive faster. The assassin was panting, and a cold sweat on his back. He felt like a helpless prey under the eyes of a beast. Even after getting into the car and getting rid of the agents outside the shop, there was still no certainty of escaping. He was a spy planted in the military committee that Hydra has spent a lot of time, resources and effort to get him where he was. Had it not been for the order from Berlin that Abraham Erskine must be killed, he would have never revealed himself. The frontal battlefield between the Allies and Axis powers was the ability of soldiers, guns and commanders. But on the intelligence level, the competition depended on the decryption of radio signals, as well as the time and depth of spying. This assassin, named Greg, could be said to be a spy with the longest infiltration time and the highest intelligence level, which Hydra had in New York. He could have played a more important role, but now there was no more opportunity. Back to Berlin, the Führer will definitely give you a medal in person. The Hydra member who was driving the car said enviously. If I can return to Berlin, then wait. There's someone behind. Greg, the assassin, just wanted to say that he was ready to go back to his hometown to get married when he finished this task, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw a tall figure running wildly in the rearview mirror. The Hydra members who thought they were safe enough to escape, had their eyes rounded with disbelief. "We need to get faster," he muttered. There was someone who could catch up to cars with their two legs. Greg, the assassin, quickly raised his gun, poked his head out of the window and tried to fight back. Luke jumped and leapt high, dodging a burst of machine gun fire and slamming into the speeding car with precision. Then, with both hands, tore open the tin roof as if it was paper. Greg, sitting in the co-pilot position, threw away the machine gun that had an empty magazine, took out a pistol and pointed it at Luke, trying to pull the trigger. With no expression, Luke's right hand directly stretched out, holding the PPK automatic pistol's muzzle. With a bang, the 7.65mm small caliber bullet hit his open palm, but it looked like it was hitting a steel plate, emitting a metal clashing sound. Luke's eyebrows slightly raised. With a strong grip, the pistol was crushed into a lump of scrap metal. "Monster!" the driver screamed in horror. "Noisy!" Luke picked the guy up with one hand and threw him out like garbage. Fling! The driver smashed into the window of a shop on the street, and fell to the ground. No one could tell if he was dead or alive. "Cut off one head and two more shall take its place. Hail Hydra!" Greg couldn't help feeling desperate when he saw Luke's frightening power. After shouting Hydra's chant, he was ready to bite the potassium cyanide poison hidden below his tongue. He has a sense of dedication to the organization and wasn't afraid of death. "I know you're a Hydra. How could I not?" Luke sneered, as if he had expected it, and leaned in to punch and dislocate the guy's jaw. In his eyes, his opponent's movements are too slow, and as long as he concentrates, it was like watching a frame-by-frame motion. Hydra was a huge organization with strict management. Every spy and agent who was sent out to perform a task would put poison on their collar or hide it in their hollowed-out dentures in order to prevent being caught or discovered and resulting in information leakage. This information was known to the SSR. Ignoring Greg's frightened eyes, Luke lifted the other party out of the car as if he was a small animal. A few minutes later, Rogers and Carter drove up. They brought the captured assassin and the driver back to the antique shop in Brooklyn. "Well done, Luke." Back to the secret base, Colonel Phillips praised him. He had witnessed Luke chasing after the assassin. Now, he was hearing the amazing story about how he caught up with the car on his feet and his palm blocking the bullet. Looking at Luke, who was taller and stronger than before, the colonel seemed to have made a decision in his heart. "You guys go out first. I have something to talk to Cavill about." Looking at the bustling medical office, Colonel Phillips called out. He drove the doctors and nurses out, and then looked at Luke with a solemn face. Luke was surprised at this. "Something wrong, Colonel?"